Okay, this is a video to help you make a scatter plot of a single set of experimental data and to add a trend line. Let's do a screen share and start looking at it. Here we go. So there's a bunch of information right here. This information is what I'm going to show you how to do in the order, and that's just there to remind me. It's a bunch of stuff. Okay, so let's say you have a data set and you recorded it for some experiment, and these were the times at which you recorded this quantity omega. That's not a W, that's an omega. Omega is like RPMs. The units that I'm using today are radians per second, but they are equivalent to RPMs. So, and let's say you had some strange physics theory, this theory that is the claim that you're testing. So, what we want to do is we want to make a plot so we can visualize this information and understand a little bit more about it and understand the experimental data and see if it conforms to this. Let's get to work. First, if you have two columns of data right next to each other, you can just highlight them with the white cursor and you're good to go. Another thing you could do is highlight the first column. Now press and hold Control and highlight the second column. That will work. Okay, that's how you select the data for the plot. Next, I'm going to hit Insert, Charts, and I want to use a scatter plot. Do not use a line plot. Line plots have certain special cases where they're useful, but most of the time we want to avoid them like the plague. So let's go over to here, insert a scatter plot. And there it is. If I'm doing an experimental plot, I want my I don't want to use this smooth line. So let me be clear here. We could have done this. We could have changed this chart type. I could have used this style of plot, but that's a bad idea. For experimental data, we want to see each individual points, and we don't want Excel to interpolate between there and make us think things we don't know are true. That is the data. So for experimental data, show it as dots. Next, the first thing that you want to do is to adjust the font and the font size, things like that. Why? Because if you don't do that first, any subsequent formatting will be erased and you'll have to redo it. So let's say I'm giving a presentation. I want to make this an 18-point font for presentation. Even though it looks bad here, it'll look great when I paste it into something else. And maybe the font that I used in my report was Times New Roman or something. So maybe I want to make the font match this. So now what have we done? We've selected, we've done this, we've picked this. Font size, great. Now I'm going to pick the font color. To get all the color at once, I'm going to click on the edge somewhere, and now I'm going to go into here and let's just make it black. So notice before it was actually kind of a light gray. So it's actually, I'm just going to get this black so it really pops. Next, we may need to add in axis labels. You always need to have some axis labels so that we can tell what these things mean. So let's say I want to make the horizontal axis label, what was it? Time in seconds. So here's my trick. Write everything without the formatting. T in seconds. Now go back and add the formatting. Variables should be italicized. See that right there? Variables are italicized. So that's cool. And then I'm going to move this over here somewhere. We'll fix that in a minute. Now over here, I don't like this horizontal or this rotated axis that is the default. I'll show you some cool tricks here in a minute. So I'm going to click Format. Whoops, sorry. I'm going to click on this one. Right click, and let's do Format Axis Title. Sorry about that. That brings up this area over here for me. And so what I can do is I can kind of play around in here and look for stuff. And then if we look here, notice there's this section right here that says rotate. So you could pick the kind of style that you like. I like this style. Now, what was this? This was omega in radians per second. Now, again, W is not right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight this, and I need the symbol font. The Greek letters are in the symbol. So I'm going to click this drop down. I'm going to type SYM. That shortcuts me to symbol. And now I'm going to hit, italics. So now I've got this. So that's looking pretty good. Now, in this case, it's pretty obvious what we're plotting since we've labeled the axes. All right. If I move this over here and make this as big as possible, right? It's obvious we're plotting omega versus t. So I argue there's no need to do a chart title here, but if you needed to, or maybe you have multiple runs, maybe you did omega versus t run 1 or something. So then you might put w versus t. We'll fix it later. We'll say run 1 or something like that. So then you go back and you italicize all variables. And then don't forget, this needs to be a symbol font. We can click font here if you want to do it this way. There we go. So now we've got this. All right, great. Okay, so where are we here? We've done, sorry, let me get rid of this. Okay, we've done this. Now, oh, if you need a subscript or a superscript, maybe we didn't want to write run 1 here, right? Maybe I want to do a subscript 1. Now, to be clear, numerical subscripts, well, to do a subscript, you right-click font, and you can do a subscript. Also, numerical subscripts should not be italicized. So I just hit Control I there. So maybe this would be another way to do that. This is omega for run 1 versus time. So there's that. Okay, what have we done now? Symbols like the capital delta symbol are not italicized. Units, notice the units are not italicized. Symbol font is what we used for the Greek letters. All right. So now let's take a look at this. This right now still looks kind of crappy. All right. In the sense of, look at this. It's all the lines look about the same. One of the things that you want to do when you're making a plot is you want your grid lines to be unobtrusive or gone entirely and use tick marks instead. You also want your axes to really pop out. So what I'm going to do here is right click. So I'm clicking somewhere on the numbers. You could click on the numbers. You could actually click on the axis itself. And I'm going to right click and format this axis. So now we always want to change these bounds, but I don't want to do it yet. I'll explain why in a minute. But one thing you could do is you could actually put some tick marks on here, and then maybe you want to do a cross or something like that. And then maybe we want to get rid of the grid lines entirely. Oops, let me do that. There we go. So I just clicked on the grid lines and hit delete. Now, if I just delete these ones, notice it's kind of confusing without those tick marks. So you probably want to put those on there. So you could just mess around in here until you find it. And there it is. So let's go down here, tick marks. There we go. Now maybe these ones I want to do inside or something like that. So you could change the style of tick mark, but this just helps your eye line up. Now, another thing I want to do is I'm going to make this axis. I want to change the color of this one. So let's do that. There's a black line. And then let's do the same thing here. Now, because I just changed the color, I can right click on the other axis and just click Control Y, or sorry, just regular click. All right, so this is starting to look pretty good. And again, if you did want to have grid lines on here, whoops, let's right click. Let's do, whoops. I'm going to click on the axis, right click, add major grid lines, and maybe I'll do this. Add major grid lines. One thing you can do if you want those grid lines on here, this is what I would recommend. Make them very faint and a light gray and maybe a dash. All right. And then I'm going to hit Control Y. That'll repeat just the last action. So I got the dash. I still need to do this, lower that down, maybe make this a light gray. And now the idea is the grid lines are there to help your eyes, but they're not up in your face, distracting from the data. So again, you could argue there's no need to have grid lines at all. All right. So let's take a look here. In this case, there's no need for a legend. We have no need for that. All right, great. Okay, so the next step is finally, before I do anything else, I'm going to right click and I'm going to save this as a template. Now I'm going to call this super plot. So I'm going to save this as a template for the super plot. That's great. And so now the next time I make a graph, if I have to make another one of these, all I have to do is right click, change the chart type, and I could pick any old template I want that I've already saved. So you can see I've got a bunch in here for different cases. So maybe I want to do a super plot, right? This is super plot, or maybe this kind. Maybe I want the grid lines. So depending what you're looking for, you could save a template and that will save you a lot of the work. Not all the work, you still have to do some. Now, after you've saved it as a template, Now we want to always do this step, adjusting the bounds to reduce wasted space. So I don't know if you could tell here, this only goes up to 3 seconds. So what am I going to do? Click on the axis. Now I'm going to right click format, and you could come into here and change the bounds. So let's manually set it to 0 and this one to 3. So now, and I could pick my own increment size. What if I want to go by 0.5s? Great. Whatever you want to do, you could change this. Look at this one. Actually, I didn't like that last change, so I'm going to get rid of it. There we go. But maybe I want to stick in minors here, and then maybe you want to put in minor tick marks, right? So you could do all kinds of stuff here. Right? And so let's do that. And so now you see these minor tick marks showing up. You get all kinds of stuff, or you could do grid lines, whatever. Again, you could do the same thing for this upper bound. It looks like it goes from about -10 up to, well, that one's about right. You're not wasting much space here, but if we were wasting space, we could do that. Finally, how do you do a trend line? I could right click on this and click add a trend line. Now here's where you have to do some thinking. When you add a trend line, sorry, I just lost it. I'm going to click back on that trend line and it gives me all these options. I want to point something out. Our claim was that this thing is a quadratic function. That's a polynomial of order 2. So if the theory says it's supposed to be a polynomial of order 2, why don't we check if it's a polynomial of order 2 by clicking right there instead of always blindly doing a linear plot? So that said, let's try that. Okay, we could do a polynomial of order 2. Now, this by itself is about useless, but we can display the equation on the chart. So what I'm doing is I'm clicking down here just to make sure you see what I'm doing. I'm clicking these so that you could see that equation on the chart. Now, this is kind of a mess because it's 18 point. Let me clear some of this mess out. All right, so we could drag this up here. All right, and now you could see this. Now, notice in this case, Y on this trend line corresponds to this symbol. So this is actually omega, and this, the x-axis, is actually time. So that's what these symbols mean here. Now, there are ways to change the sig figs and other things you could do. But notice, according to this does not actually match up to that theory very well, even though we have an R² value close to 1. Why? Because the dominant term in here is this linear term, at least over this scale, right? Look how small this term is, right? So this is not actually a good fit, even though the R² value is close to 1. And so that's something we might dig deeper into at another time. Let's just go through our checklist and see if there's anything else I forgot to say. Okay, so what was our goal in this video? To make a plot and to choose the right trend line. Okay, so you select it. Make sure you pick a scatter plot. The font. Why do you pick the font first? Look what happens if I change the font. All that formatting gets lost. It's kind of a nuisance to have to redo it. So let's undo that. Okay, you can pick the font size. The same thing happens if you change the font size, right? Whoops. Sorry, if I do that in here, the same thing will happen. Okay, font color. Then don't forget you need axis labels. Variables are italicized. Units are not italicized. Here's some special issues. If you're trying to do subscripts and superscripts, there you go. If you're trying to do Greek letters, there you go. Tick marks or light grid lines. We do not want those big obtrusive grid lines. Keep them light or switch them out to tick marks. Save it as a template before you adjust the bounds, then adjust the bounds to reduce wasted space. Then you can add the trend line and think, do you really need a title or a legend? Oh, by the way, if you did a couple of extra things, you can always go in here and save this as a template again at the end. The problem is if you've already adjusted the bounds and your next data set has different bounds, maybe there's different numbers, you may think you didn't do the plot right because you might not be able to see it. So that's why I usually do this. So I argue you could take this trend line and actually move it up if you wanted to. That's it.